My son Trevor stood in the middle of his brand new recording studio, the one I paid for, and told every musician in that room that I had never believed in him. Not Melissa Crane, the woman who had been quietly redirecting his money for months. Not the debt building up behind the soundproofed walls. Me, his mother. I had emptied my savings, signed my name on equipment leases, and carried his dream when it was still just chord progressions hummed at my kitchen table. But the night I refused to co-sign one more loan, Trevor looked at me like I was a stranger. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I simply walked out into the cold Halifax night and drove home alone. And the next morning I stopped funding everything. If you've ever sacrificed everything for someone who eventually made you feel like the problem, please like this video and tell me in the comments what you would have done. I'd genuinely love to know. And let me know where you're watching from today. I read every single comment. My husband Gordon Whitfield used to say that Halifax fog either made you patient or made you lost. After 38 years living on the eastern edge of this country, I think it did a little of both to me. The morning after Trevor told that room full of strangers I had never believed in him, I sat alone in our kitchen, listening to rain against the window above the sink. Gordon's old mug, the blue one with the chipped handle he refused to throw away, was still on the shelf beside mine, even though he had been gone for nearly 3 years. I don't know why I kept it there. Maybe because putting it in a box would mean admitting the kitchen belonged only to me now. Gordon died from a stroke in November 2 weeks before what would have been our 40th anniversary. 1 minute he was shoveling the front walk, the way he always did before I could get to it, and the next minute our neighbor, Pauline, was calling me from the driveway because she'd found him sitting against the fence. I held his hand in the hospital for 11 hours before he passed. He never opened his eyes again, but I talked to him the whole time. I told him about the birds at the feeder. I told him about the good soup I'd made Tuesday. I kept my voice steady because I knew, somehow, that panic would only confuse him on his way out. Gordon had been an electrician his entire career. We were not wealthy people. We lived in a narrow 2-story on a quiet street in Dartmouth, drove sensible cars, and took our vacations somewhere within a day's drive. But Gordon was the kind of man who kept every promise he ever made and never once let a neighbor go without help when the power went out. People trusted him immediately. That kind of steady, quiet reliability feels rare now. Before he died, Gordon made sure I would at least be safe. He left me the house, a modest savings account, and a life insurance policy that wasn't extravagant, but was enough to keep me comfortable if I stayed careful. And I did stay careful. I went back to part-time work at the dental office, where I'd been an office manager for 20 years. I meal planned. I kept the same SAR. I ignored the broken tile in the bathroom because replacing it felt unnecessary when there were more important things to hold on to. And every time I thought about spending money on myself, I thought about Trevor instead. Trevor was our only child. From the time he was small, he heard music in everything. At 7 years old, he dismantled Gordon's old clock radio trying to understand how sound came out of it. Gordon pretended to be angry and couldn't keep a straight face. "He's got a good ear," he told me that night. "He's got a destructive streak," I answered. But secretly I had recorded every little song Trevor ever sang into the cassette player I kept in the living room closet. Trevor could walk into any room and pick out the song playing faintly through someone else's headphones. In high school, he played guitar in 3 different bands simultaneously and still managed to pass his exams. In college, he studied audio engineering in Toronto for 2 years before the tuition became too heavy and he came home. I still remember how he looked walking through the front door with his equipment cases and his eyes cast down. "I failed," he said quietly. "No," I told him. "You paused. There's a difference." That's what mothers say when they're trying to keep a heart from cracking all the way through. After Gordon died, Trevor grew gentler with me for a while. He called every evening. He drove over on Sunday mornings and made breakfast while I sat at the table with my coffee, pretending I didn't notice he was doing all the dishes before he left. Then one afternoon about a 1.5 years ago, he sat across from me at that same kitchen table with something trembling behind his eyes. Not sadness, anticipation. "Mum," he said, "I think I finally found my chance." He turned his laptop toward me, a commercial space in a converted warehouse in Dartmouth's North End. Exposed brick, high ceilings, thick walls already half insulated. A building that looked serious about sound. "I want to open a recording studio," he said. "A real one, for local artists who can't afford the big places in Toronto." I looked at his face while he talked. He looked alive, in a way I hadn't seen since before Gordon's funeral. The kind of alive that only happens when someone believes their life still has something specific waiting inside it. "What would you call it?" I asked. "Harbor Sound." He smiled when he said it, a little shyly, like he was afraid I'd find it too plain. "I didn't find it." I cried a little, quietly, while he was looking at the screen. Because for the first time since Gordon died, something felt like it might grow toward light. Trevor reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I know it's a risk," he said, "but I really think I can make it work." And I believed him. I believed every word. Over the next several months, I poured money into that dream. I paid the deposit on the commercial space. I helped cover the first 4 months of rent. I contributed toward acoustic panels, mixing boards, microphones, and a used isolation booth Trevor found listed online from a studio closing in Moncton. I dipped into a portion of Gordon's life insurance to help pay for a used grand piano a local musician was selling. Because Trevor insisted a proper room needed a piano. Every time I handed him another check, he hugged me tightly and said things like, "You're the only person who's ever really believed in me." Or, "I'm going to make you so proud, Mum." And for a while, I thought I already was. I spent Saturday afternoons at Harbor Sound, handing Trevor coffee and helping him label cables. I swept sawdust off the floor during the renovation weeks. Some evenings I stayed late folding equipment manuals and organizing binders while Trevor worked on wiring with Gordon's old toolkit. Those were some of the quietest, happy moments I'd had since the funeral. Then Melissa Crane arrived. The first time I met her, she walked into the studio wearing a leather jacket that looked like it had been purchased specifically to look effortless. She was confident in a way that filled the doorway before she even stepped through it. Trevor introduced her while practically bouncing on his heels. "Mum, this is Melissa. She's helping me with artist development and brand strategy." Artist development and brand strategy. I remember thinking that sounded like a very expensive combination of words. Melissa shook my hand and smiled warmly. "Trevor talks about you constantly," she said. "You're the reason any of this is possible." At the time, I thought it sounded gracious. Now I realize she never called me his mother, only the reason this was possible. And slowly, after Melissa entered our lives, my son began changing in ways I told myself were simply growing pains. At first, everything seemed energized. Trevor talked faster, moved with more purpose, started using words like monetization and artist pipeline. He'd been working so hard and for so long in isolation that I told myself he simply needed someone in his corner who spoke the language of the industry. That's the dangerous thing about manipulation. It rarely arrives looking threatening. It arrives wearing enthusiasm and industry knowledge, and the particular energy of someone who seems to know things you don't. For the first few weeks after Melissa joined Harbor Sound, everything felt exciting. Trevor said things like, "Melissa thinks we should reposition the brand," and "Melissa knows people at CBC Music," and "Melissa says studios that stay regional never grow past regional." I nodded along because I wanted to support him. But gradually, the studio I had helped build started feeling like somewhere I hadn't been invited. One afternoon I stopped by with sandwiches to find 2 men installing expensive acoustic wall panels that weren't on any budget sheet I'd seen. I stared at them, confused. "What happened to the panels Gordon's brother helped you put in?" I asked. Trevor barely looked up from his laptop. "Melissa said they weren't industry grade." I blinked. "Your uncle spent 3 weekends on those." Something uncomfortable moved across Trevor's face. Then it disappeared. "We need a cleaner sound profile, Mum." A cleaner sound profile. That phrase started appearing everywhere. The second-hand piano I'd helped buy moved to a back corner to make room for a digital production suite Melissa said was essential. The wall of photographs Trevor had hung of local Halifax artists, people he grew up admiring, quietly came down and were replaced by a sleek logo treatment she'd had designed. The warm, slightly rough quality that made the space feel like a real working studio slowly became something colder, more polished, more like an advertisement for itself. Every week brought another expense, another redesign, another invoice. And somehow every change made the studio feel less like Trevor. Still, I kept helping. Because mothers are very good at absorbing small pains when they believe love will eventually make the sacrifice worth it. I worked mornings at the dental office and spent evenings at Harbor Sound, sometimes just sitting in the corner with a book to keep Trevor company. While he mixed tracks and Melissa took calls in the hallway. Sometimes I noticed the way she interrupted him mid-sentence during conversations with artists, or how quickly his own opinions disappeared when hers contradicted them. One evening while I was organizing supply invoices in the back room, I heard them talking quietly near the front board. "We can't afford the showcase," Trevor said, his voice low. "We can't afford to skip it," Melissa answered immediately. "We've already spent $8,000 on the launch campaign. If the showcase looks low budget, no one serious will take Harbor Sound seriously." A pause. Then Melissa's voice softened. "Trevor, you said you wanted to build something real. Real things require real investment." I leaned around the doorframe slightly. Trevor looked exhausted in a way I hadn't let myself see clearly until that moment. His shoulders were tight, and his hands moved restlessly over the console. But when Melissa touched his arm, he nodded. That image stayed with me for days. Not because I thought there was anything romantic between them, because I recognized the expression on my son's face. It was the look of someone who had stopped trusting their own instincts. About 2 months before Harbor Sound's official opening, Trevor began asking me for money more frequently. At first, the requests came wrapped in temporary language. "Just to bridge the cash flow until launch, or the return will be significant once we have signed clients." Then the amounts grew. $4,000 for a social media campaign. $2,500 for custom merchandise for the launch event. $6,000 for what Melissa called an industry relations retainer. One rainy Tuesday, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by receipts while Trevor stood nearby explaining why he needed another transfer. "Melissa says we need stronger visibility before the doors open." I rubbed my forehead. "Trevor, I already sent money for marketing. That was phase 1. "Phase 1 of what?" He exhaled with a patience he was clearly working to maintain. "Mum, this is how the industry works now." I looked at the numbers again. The studio still hadn't officially opened. "How much have we spent altogether?" I asked carefully. Trevor went very still for just half a second. That pause frightened me more than any number could have. "I'd have to add it all up," he said. "You don't know? We're investing in growth. That's different from spending." I stared at him. "That's not what I asked." His jaw tightened. "Why are you interrogating me?" That word. I sat back slowly. I wasn't a bank. I wasn't a creditor. I was his mother, draining Gordon's insurance money to keep his dream from collapsing before it started. "I'm not interrogating you," I said quietly. "I'm trying to understand." Trevor crossed his arms. "Melissa said this might happen." A coldness moved through me. "What does that mean?" she said. "Older people sometimes panic when they see startup costs because they're used to thinking small." Older people thinking small. Every conversation lately sounded like a podcast I hadn't subscribed to. I leaned forward slowly. "Trevor." I chose my words carefully. "Are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. For one moment I saw my son again. The 12-year-old who used to record himself playing guitar on a handheld recorder and leave the tapes on my pillow for me to find. Then his expression closed. "I'll be happy when people in this industry start taking me seriously." That answer broke something quietly inside me, because it wasn't about music anymore. It was about proof, and people who need to prove themselves to the world are the easiest people in the world to lead somewhere they never intended to go. A few days later, I arrived at Harbor Sound earlier than expected and found Melissa alone inside, reviewing documents on her laptop. She looked up with a practiced smile. "Deb, early day?" I set down the coffee I'd brought Trevor. My eyes landed on a stack of printed invoices near her keyboard. One caught my attention immediately. Crane Creative Consulting. Strategic Brand Development. Amount owing $6,200. I looked at her carefully. "Crane Creative Consulting. Is that your company?" She barely changed expression. "That's right. You own the company receiving these payments?" "Of course." The answer came so easily. I almost doubted my own concern. "That's entirely standard. How many payments have gone to your company?" Something shifted slightly in her smile. "Trevor approves every invoice." Trevor is using money I provided." Her voice remained pleasant, but something cooled underneath it. With respect, Deb, once money enters a business account, the personal relationship it came from stops being relevant. The personal relationship it came from. As if a mother funding her son's dream was simply a financial transaction she'd already filed away. Trevor walked in before I could respond. The moment he saw us both, his body tensed. "What's going on?" "I'm asking questions," I said calmly. He immediately looked defensive. "Mom, not now. I just want to understand where the money is going. You don't trust me." And there it was, not concern, not explanation, only offense. I looked around the studio, the polished surfaces, the new logo on the wall. The expensive equipment I'd helped purchase now, surrounded by even more expensive equipment I didn't recognize. Something in my chest went cold for the first time. Not fear of losing money. Fear of losing my son to a version of his dream that no longer had anything to do with him. A week later, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Mothers do that constantly. We sand down sharp truths until they're smooth enough to hold without bleeding. I kept telling myself Trevor was under pressure. That launching a business was brutal. That he had always come back to himself eventually. But something had already shifted between us. Not loudly. The way ice changes under pressure, not cracking, just weaning invisibly. One Thursday afternoon, I stopped by with homemade fish chowder because I knew Trevor had been skipping real meals. Harbor Sound looked beautiful that day. Low, warm lighting catching the grain of the wood panels. Soft instrumental music through the monitors. I was proud of what it had become. Despite everything, I was heading toward the back office when I heard voices from the live room. "Your mom seems really supportive," a young man's voice said. One of the session musicians Trevor had been working with. Trevor laughed quietly. "She means well, but honestly, she doesn't really get what we're building here. Stopped walking. What do you mean?" "She still thinks I don't know, like it's a small local thing." Melissa understands the actual vision. The container of chowder in my hands felt very heavy suddenly. "She worries too much," Trevor continued. "Every time there's a new investment, she gets anxious." "I guess parents can be like that," the musician said. "My mom takes it to another level," Trevor said lightly. I stood there in the hallway while something went very quiet inside me. There are moments when your heart doesn't break loudly. It breaks in complete silence, and you're the only witness. I walked forward. Trevor looked up and his face immediately rearranged itself into a smile. "Mum, I didn't hear you come in." I held up the container. "I brought chowder." Guilt crossed his face for exactly 1 second. "That's sweet," he said. "Sweet, not thank you. Not I missed you. Just sweet, the way you'd thank a stranger who held a door." 3 weeks later, Trevor called and asked me to dinner. His voice sounded careful, measured, not the way my son usually spoke to me. "Just the two of us," he said. "I think we should talk." Hope came back so quickly it embarrassed me. I arrived at the small Italian restaurant Trevor had chosen, and he was already there, sitting in a booth near the back. But Melissa was there too, and beside her a man I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, early 50s, expensive watch, the kind of person who takes up more than their share of a room without seeming to notice. "Mum," Trevor stood quickly. "I'm glad you came. This is Derek Voss. He's interested in Harbor Sound." Interested in what sense? I wanted to ask. Instead, I shook Derek's hand and sat down carefully. Dinner started with careful small talk. Derek asked polite questions about Halifax. Melissa discussed music industry trends with the confidence of someone reading from a report. Trevor nodded along more than he spoke. I watched him. "The East Coast music scene is genuinely underserved," Derek said, swirling his wine. "The right facility at the right moment could become a significant regional anchor." I buttered my roll. "Has Harbor Sound turned a profit yet?" A brief quiet fell over the table. "We're in early growth stage," Melissa said. "That wasn't my question." Trevor put down his fork. "Mum, no has it?" He exhaled. "We're still building the client base, so no." He didn't answer. "Then what is Derek's interest, exactly?" Derek smiled the smooth smile of a man who'd navigated harder questions. "Co-investment. Harbor Sound has real potential, but expansion would require additional capital to get ahead of the curve." My stomach tightened. Expansion to where? Trevor glanced at Melissa before answering. That glance told me more than the words did. "Toronto," he said. I set my fork down. "You haven't even fully launched the Halifax location." Melissa stepped in. That's exactly why this conversation matters now. Momentum in this industry is everything. Trevor nodded. We could have a second location operational within 18 months. I looked at him directly. With what money? Silence. Derek leaned forward. The financing structure would involve some secured lending, and we'd need a guarantor with established assets. There it was. I felt my pulse slow to something deliberate and careful. You mean my house, I said. Trevor's jaw tightened. It would be temporary collateral. No collateral is temporary if the business fails. Melissa's voice stayed pleasant. Risk aversion is understandable, Deb, but it does limit opportunity. I looked at my son, sitting beside this woman across the candlelit table, and I felt something I hadn't felt before in all of this. Not anger. Grief. Because Trevor wasn't making this ask. He was delivering it. On someone else's behalf. You always said you believed in me, Trevor said quietly. And there was the sentence that cracked something open. Delivered softly, but aimed precisely. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I gathered my coat from the booth beside me. I do believe in you, I said. I have never stopped believing in you, but I will not risk the last home your father ever lived in. I stood up carefully. Trevor started to speak. I raised my hand gently. Not tonight, I said, and I walked out of that restaurant into the cold Halifax air, sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, while Gordon's voice came back to me from somewhere far away. Don't spend your peace trying to buy someone's approval. He'd said that to me once about a difficult friendship I'd been holding on to too long. I hadn't understood then who he'd really been talking about. That night, I went home and I called my oldest friend, Carla Innes. We'd known each other since nursing school, even though I'd gone into dental administrations and she'd gone into pediatric care. Carla had a gift for seeing exactly what I was circling around before I could name it myself. How long has this Melissa been in the picture? She asked. 7 months, and before her, Trevor still had his head on straight? I thought about it honestly, mostly. He was stressed about money, but he still sounded like himself. Carla paused. This woman profits from his spending? I think so. I found invoices from her company. Then she doesn't need him to succeed. She needs him to keep spending. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. The following Monday, I did something I should have done months earlier. I drove to the bank, the same one Gordon and I had used for 30 years, where a manager named Phil Arsenault had helped us set up Trevor's education fund when he was 3 years old. I didn't call ahead. I just went. A younger officer met with me. I explained the situation plainly. She reviewed the preliminary loan structure Trevor had emailed me. Her expression became more careful with every page. Miss Whitfield, she said finally, if you sign as guarantor and the business is unable to service the loan, the bank could pursue repayment through any secured asset listed in the agreement. My house. Gordon's house. The place where his boots were still in the front closet because I hadn't decided what to do with them. I drove home feeling emptied out. Rain slid down the windshield the whole way. I thought about a night, maybe 6 years ago, when Trevor had been going through a hard time after a breakup and came home and sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the fridge. And I'd sat down beside him and we'd stayed there for 2 hours eating crackers and not saying much at all. I thought about how easy it had been to know how to love him then. That evening, I opened my laptop and reviewed the automatic transfers I'd set up to support Harbor Sound. Rent assistance, monthly equipment fund, marketing installment, software subscriptions, money flowing out of my account for almost a year, quietly, the way things always leak before you realize you're running low. I sat there for a long time looking at the screen. Then I thought about what Carla had said. She doesn't need him to succeed. She needs him to keep spending. I did not cancel anything that night, but I began paying very close attention. 2 days later, I asked Trevor to send me a full accounting of Harbor Sound's finances. I kept my message short and neutral. Just a mother wanting to understand the full picture before making any decisions about the loan guarantee. He didn't respond for 18 hours. When he did, the message said Melissa was compiling the documents and would send them over. The documents never came. A week passed. Then I received an invitation. Not from Trevor, but from Melissa, forwarded through him, to Harbor Sound's official launch showcase. Local artists performing, industry guests, a proper opening. I was listed on the invitation as a founding supporter. Founding supporter. Not his mother. A category. I went anyway. The studio looked extraordinary that evening. Soft light, good sound, a crowd of musicians and journalists, and people who looked like they belonged in the music industry. Trevor stood near the front greeting guests with energy I hadn't seen from him in months. Alive again. The same way Claire had looked in Diana's story. Or so I'd thought about my own son often enough. Bright, performing so hard I wasn't sure where the performance ended. I found him between conversations, and he kissed my cheek quickly. "You came. Doesn't it look incredible?" "It does," I said honestly. His eyes moved briefly past me, scanning the room. "Melissa needs me in a second, but stay. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy yourself." Like I was a guest at someone else's party. Later, a journalist approached me near the refreshment table. "Are you Trevor's mum?" She smiled warmly. "He talks about you. Does he? He said you made all of this possible." I nodded. "Because what else do you do?" Across the room, a group gathered around Trevor and Melissa and the man Derek Voss who'd been at dinner. Trevor laughed at something Derek said. Melissa placed her hand on Trevor's shoulder in a way that looked proprietary, like touching something she'd already claimed. Then I heard Trevor introduce me to someone nearby. An older musician, someone who seemed genuinely kind, who'd asked who I was. "That's my mum," Trevor said. "She helped out early on. Helped out early on. Not she believed in me before anyone else. Not she funded this entire room. Just helped out. Past tense. Early on. As though I were part of the scaffolding that had already been removed now that the building stood." I set my glass down on a nearby table carefully. The room was full of good sound and warm light, and I had helped pay for all of it, and I was invisible inside it. Then Melissa appeared at my elbow with a folder I recognized immediately from the restaurant dinner. "Now might actually be a good time to look this over," she said pleasantly. "Derek's people need an answer by end of the week." I looked at the folder without touching it. "I'm not discussing documents tonight," I said. Her smile didn't waver. "Of course! I just thought, since you're here anyway." "I said not tonight." She tilted her head slightly, recalibrating. Then Trevor appeared beside her, reading the situation instantly. His expression tightened. "Mum, can you just—" "She never believed in this," Melissa said, her voice light but aimed precisely. "Not really. You've worked too hard to keep apologizing for ambition." The room didn't go quiet. Nobody else noticed. But something shifted permanently in that moment because Trevor didn't correct her. "He didn't say that isn't true." He just looked at me with something exhausted and guilty, and somewhere underneath it, afraid. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said. I looked at my son who I had sat on the kitchen floor with, whose first guitar I had driven 4 hours to find secondhand because it was the one he wanted, whose grief over his father had wept itself out on my shoulder in the hospital parking lot. "You helped out early on," I said quietly. He frowned. "What?" "That's how you introduced me tonight." She helped out early on. His face changed. The guilt surfaced fully for just a moment, real and unguarded. "Mum, I didn't mean. I know what you meant." I picked up my coat from the chair beside me. "And I know what I have to do." I walked out of Harbor Sound into the cold, dark street. Behind me, music started up from the live room. Someone very good playing something I would have wanted to stay and listen to under different circumstances. I barely slept. By 4 a.m, I was in the kitchen in my housecoat, Gordon's mug in my hands, though I hadn't made coffee yet, just holding it. The tile above the backsplash had a crack in it I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. I kept leaving it because Gordon had said he'd get to it eventually, and changing it felt like erasing something. I sat at the table and let myself say the thing I hadn't said aloud yet. He stopped seeing me. Not as an obstacle, not as the enemy, just stopped seeing me as a person with a life and a grief and a house that held 38 years of a marriage inside it. I had become, in my son's mind, a resource. A line of funding that occasionally produced friction. At 7:30, I opened my laptop, and I canceled every automatic transfer connected to Harbor Sound. The rent assistance, the equipment fund, the marketing installments. One by one, deliberately, the way you remove stitches from a wound that needs to close differently. Then I wrote Trevor an email. I rewrote it 4 times. The first version was too angry. The second sounded like an apology I didn't owe. The third read like I was begging him not to resent me. The fourth was simply the truth. I told him I would no longer provide financial support until I received a complete accounting of Harbor Sound's finances, including all payments to Crane Creative Consulting. I told him I loved him. I told him those two facts were not in conflict. I pressed send. His first call came 11 minutes later. I didn't answer. Then another. Then 3 more in a row. Then a voicemail. "Mom, what are you doing? Payroll is next week. I have session bookings starting Monday. You can't just..." His voice cracked. "Call me back." The second voicemail an hour later sounded different. "Stia dear." Coached, I thought, though it hurt to think it. This is really unfair. You don't understand what I'm building, and you never have. Melissa said you might do something like this, but I defended you. Defended me. As though I owed him gratitude for that. Carla called that afternoon. I told her what I'd done. She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said simply. "It doesn't feel good." "No," she agreed. "It feels like surgery. That's different from good." 2 days later, something unexpected happened. A young woman knocked on my door in the early evening. She was maybe 26, small, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from deciding to do something difficult and not letting yourself think too long about it. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "My name is Amber Reeves. I used to work at Harbor Sound." I stepped aside immediately. Amber sat on the edge of the couch and held her tea mug in both hands. She told me she'd been Trevor's studio coordinator for 5 months before leaving. "At first it was wonderful," she said. "Trevor really cared about the music, about the artists. He spent half a day once helping a 17-year-old from Spryfield fix a demo track she couldn't afford to re-record." "That sounds like him," I said quietly. Then Melissa started showing up more, and things changed. She told me about session blocks that got canceled to make room for Melissa's preferred clients, who then didn't show. About invoices from Crane Creative that appeared on the studio's expense reports without any clear deliverable attached. About how Trevor stopped questioning things after one afternoon meeting with Melissa, when he came out looking like someone who'd been firmly redirected. "He started paying invoices late," Amber said. "Mine included. Never, by much, he always apologized. I don't think he wanted to be that person." That sentence, "I don't think he wanted to be that person," sat in my chest like something I hadn't realized I'd needed to hear. Before she left, Amber paused at my door. "I know he hurt you, but I think he's in over his head in a way he doesn't fully understand yet." After she left, I called Carla again. I told her about Amber, about the invoices, about Melissa's consulting company appearing repeatedly on Harbor Sound's expense record. "I think she profits from expansion," I said. "Not from success? From spending," Carla exhaled. "You need a lawyer, Deb." I called Margaret Chung the next morning. She had an office in a heritage building downtown, 3rd floor, overlooking the harbor. She had the kind of steady, unhurried manner that made people trust her with difficult things. She reviewed everything I brought. The invoices Amber had described, the email chain from Melissa, the preliminary loan documents. She took almost 2 hours. Then she folded her hands carefully on the desk. "Your instincts are correct," she said. "This consulting arrangement is structured to benefit the consultant, regardless of business performance. I already knew that, but hearing it from a lawyer changed something." Then Margaret Chung slid one document toward me and asked calmly if I recognized it. I looked down. It appeared to be a supplemental agreement attached to the loan structure. My name appeared near the bottom. My signature appeared near the bottom. I stared at it. "I never signed this." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You're certain?" "I've never seen this document before in my life." She studied the signature carefully. "The formation is slightly inconsistent. This may warrant forensic examination." I pressed both hands flat on my knees to keep them steady. Whether Trevor had been involved or not, I didn't know, couldn't know yet. I was now looking at the possibility that someone had put my name on a document I'd never touched. Gordon's house, my children's piano lessons, my retirement savings, everything I had left of the life we'd built together, all of it potentially exposed through a signature I hadn't written. "What do I do?" I asked Margaret. "From this point forward, all communication in writing," she said. "And when Trevor contacts you," she paused, "help him. But not the way you have been." I drove home in the dark. Harbor Sound's social media had posted about the launch that morning. Photographs of the studio, warm lighting, artists laughing, Trevor in the center of all of it. looking like someone who had made all of this happen himself. The caption read, "Building something real takes courage. Grateful for everyone who actually showed up." I closed the app. The collapse didn't come all at once. It rarely does. It came in leaked complaints on a local music forum, unpaid invoices to a session drummer, a mastering engineer left waiting on a payment since the launch. Then a local artist, Trevor, had promised a discounted recording block, who hadn't been able to reach anyone at the studio for 2 weeks. Ryan called me. He was a musician Trevor had known since high school and one of his closest friends. "I don't know what's happening over there," Ryan said quietly. "He sounds terrible." Then Trevor himself called late on a Wednesday night. His voice was different from the voicemails. Not coached, not steadied, just small. "Mum." That was all he said for a moment. "I'm here," I said. "I think Melissa has been. I think something's really wrong." "What happened?" A long pause. "She changed the passwords. The website admin, the booking system, the supplier portal. She said it was for restructuring, but now I can't access anything and she's not returning my calls." My chest tightened. "Trevor, listen to me very carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't delete anything. Document everything you can access right now." "I can't access anything," he said. His voice broke slightly on the last word. "Then come home." He didn't come that night, but Ryan did. He showed up at my door around midnight, with his coat still on and printed emails in his hand. "I went through what I could find," he said. He laid the papers on the table. "Mum, these are bad." He'd found email correspondence between Melissa and Derek Voss going back months before she'd even been introduced to Trevor. Planning language. Phrases about acquiring equity leverage through debt saturation of inexperienced independent studios. My son's name appeared in these emails. His ambition, his emotional investment, his need for validation, described in clinical strategic terms, like characteristics to be used. I sat down slowly. Ryan looked sick. She never intended to build anything with him. I knew that, but seeing it written out in someone else's careful words, that was different. That was evidence of intent, of calculation, of the deliberate targeting of a man who simply loved music and needed someone to believe in his future. I thought about Trevor at 7 years old taking apart that clock radio. I thought about Gordon saying he's got a good ear. I thought about the lemon loaf. No, that wasn't my story. I thought about the homemade chowder nobody ate. About the pancake recipe. That wasn't mine either. I thought about the tape recordings I'd kept in the closet. Trevor's small voice singing songs he'd made up. The tapes I still had in a shoebox in the spare room because I'd never been able to throw them out. Margaret Chung called a meeting. It was a Thursday. Gray sky, harbor quiet. Everyone arrived separately. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Ryan came with Trevor. I came with Carla, and Melissa Crane arrived last, in that leather jacket, with a composure I had to grudgingly acknowledge even then. The first 20 minutes were documentation. Margaret walked methodically through the financial record. Crane creative payments, the consulting percentage structure, the unsigned but signed anyway liability document. She was precise, and she was devastating without raising her voice once. Melissa remained collected through most of it. Brief deflections, industry standard practice, mutual agreement. Then Margaret placed the suspect document in front of her and pointed to the signature. "Can you explain your involvement in producing this document?" For the first time, Melissa's composure had to work at it. "Administrative processing," she said carefully. "So you were involved in the handling of this document." A beat too long. I facilitated document preparation. Trevor had been quiet through the entire meeting. I'd been watching him out of the corner of my eye, watching the color shift in his face as layer after layer was turned over. When the email correspondence with Derek Voss was placed on the table, he read it slowly. I watched his jaw tighten. Watched him read the line about leveraging emotional investment and studio debt to create acquisition opportunity. He looked up at Melissa. "You said you believed in what I was building." She met his eyes. And I'll never forget what she said, because even cornered, she almost found her footing. "I did believe in it. We had different ideas about what building it meant." Trevor stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the table. Something changed in his face. Not drama, just the quiet deflation of a person who has finally stopped arguing with the truth. He didn't speak for the rest of the meeting. Melissa was asked to leave separately. Margaret outlined next steps. There would be forensic review of the signature, legal options for recovering improperly invoiced funds, potential liability for both Melissa and Derek Voss. When it was over and the room had cleared, Trevor and I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. The harbor was visible through the window. Pale November light on gray water. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said finally. Just that, quietly. He didn't try to contextualize it or soften it, or explain himself into a better position. Just "I'm sorry, Mum." I looked at my son, tired, ashamed, still sitting a little stiffly, because pride doesn't fully leave even when it should, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. "I know," I said. He was quiet. "I stopped seeing you. I let that sit between us." "You were grieving," I said eventually. "That's not an excuse. No, but it's part of the truth." He rubbed both hands over his face. "I needed someone to tell me I was extraordinary, and he stopped. "She knew exactly to do that." I nodded. "That's how it works." Dad would have seen through her immediately. I thought about that. Maybe he might also have given her the benefit of the doubt longer than you'd think. He was generous that way. Trevor looked at me. "But he would have believed you." Something behind my eyes went warm. "Yes," I said. "He would have." We sat there for a while longer. The harbor went darker. Eventually, Trevor asked, very quietly, something that sounded much younger than he was. "Can I come over for dinner this week?" I looked at him for a moment. "Tuesday," I said. "I'll make the fish chowder properly, not in a takeaway container." He almost smiled. "I'd really like that." Harbor Sound didn't survive in its original form. The debts were real, and the damage from Melissa's management was significant enough that a restructure was the only honest option. Trevor spent 3 difficult months working with Margaret's office and an accountant to understand the full picture. Derek Voss quietly withdrew when it became clear that legal exposure was likely. Melissa eventually settled privately on the improperly invoiced amounts. The forged signature matter was unresolved for a long time, and then resolved in a way I won't fully explain here. But my name was cleared. What remained was a smaller thing. A single studio room Trevor rented month to month in a shared creative space near the waterfront. No grand piano, no luxury branding. Just good acoustics and a mixing console and a door that local artists could actually afford to walk through. He started over, not dramatically. Just quietly, the way most real things begin. I watched him differently after that. Not with the anxious watchfulness of someone waiting for disaster, but with something steadier. He called most evenings again. He came on Sunday mornings when he didn't have sessions booked. He started telling me again about the music. Actual music. What a particular song was trying to do. Why a chorus wasn't landing right. What he heard in a young artist's voice that other people weren't listening for yet. One evening, he helped me finally replace the cracked tile above the kitchen backsplash. We had to go to 3 different hardware stores to find one that matched close enough. He spent 2 hours on the job and talked the entire time about a 17-year-old he'd been working with who reminded him of why he'd wanted to do this in the first place. "She doesn't need to be famous," he said, pressing the new tile into place. "She just needs someone to help her hear what's already good." I handed him the grout and didn't say anything because the moment felt like it had enough in it already. Some evenings he still got quiet in the way that looked like Gordon, staring past things, listening to something the rest of the room couldn't hear. I'd learned to leave those moments alone. You can't rush a person back from grief. You just stay nearby and let them find their own way back to the surface. Trust didn't return all at once. I'd told him that plainly, and I meant it, but it came back in small, consistent things. He showed me the studio accounts monthly, without being asked, from a plain spreadsheet on his laptop. He introduced me to a musician he was working with as my mum, Deb. She's the reason I'm still doing this. Not helped out early on, not founding supporter, his mum. That winter, on Gordon's birthday, Trevor and I drove out to the cemetery together in the early afternoon. We brought a thermos of coffee. Because it was cold enough that our breath showed, and we stood there for a while without saying much. Trevor had brought one of Gordon's old crochet hooks. Gordon had taken it up late in life, and Trevor thought it was the funniest and most Gordon thing he'd ever done, and he'd had it restored and cleaned, and he laid it against the base of the headstone. He would have hated Melissa, Trevor said finally. He would have been polite to her for a very long time, I said. And then one day he would have said one quiet sentence that dismantled her entire argument and walked away before she could respond. Trevor laughed. It was real, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere true. I hadn't heard it in a long time. I slipped my hand into his arm the way I used to when he was young, and we walked somewhere cold together. We stood there a little longer. The sky was very pale. A crow landed on the stone beside Gordon's and regarded us with no particular opinion. Some wounds don't disappear when people apologize. Some trust takes a long time to rebuild. Some seasons are just cold and gray, and you move through them slowly, without knowing exactly when spring is coming, only knowing that it will. But that afternoon, standing in the cold with my son beside me, and a crow on a headstone and a thermos of coffee going lukewarm between us, I felt something I hadn't felt since before all of it began. Not triumph, not relief, just the particular, ordinary, irreplaceable peace of loving someone honestly and being loved back the same way. That, I've come to understand, is what was always worth protecting.